It began, as disasters often do, on a night that seemed ordinary. Late October, 1948, the small steel town of Donora, Pennsylvania sat tucked along the Monongahela River, its narrow valley lined with houses, mills, and the constant pulse of industry. The people of Donora were used to smoking. It was the town's perfume, acrid, metallic, and familiar. To them, it meant jobs, security, and heat in the winter. But on October 26, the air changed. That morning, a heavy gray fog rolled down the hills and settled over the streets like wet wool. It was thicker than usual, damp and sour, making headlights glow like pale ghosts. Locals shrugged it off. Autumn fog was common here, but this one didn't move. It clung to the rooftops, hugging the ground, swallowing everything in sight. By noon, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The Zinc Works, an American steel wire plant, twin beasts of metal and fire, continued to belch fumes into the mist, a cocktail of sulfur dioxide, fluorides, and metal dust. Under normal circumstances, the valley winds would sweep it away. But a temperature inversion, a rare weather pattern, had locked the air like a lid on a pot. The smoke couldn't rise. It just sat there, and so did the people. At first, the townsfolk coughed and complained about the bad air. Windows were shut, children were told to stay indoors. But by evening, people began to choke. Eyes burned, lungs seared. The air grew metallic, heavy with something unseen. Inside the small homes along McKean Avenue, mothers noticed their children turning pale and dizzy. The family dog whined and refused to eat. Chickens in backyard coops stopped moving altogether. The local undertaker, Charles Stacy, would later recall that by the end of the first night, the air felt like breathing through wet cement. Still, the mills ran. The factory whistles screamed at shift change. The management assured workers that it was only fog, no reason to panic, no cause to stop production. After all, the mills had never stopped before. But in the quiet residential streets, panic had already begun to spread. By the second day, the fog grew yellowish-gray, like tarnished brass. Drivers abandoned cars in the road because they couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The hospital, a modest building with limited staff, was flooded with patients gasping for air. Dr. William Rongos, one of Donora's few physicians, worked without sleep. He'd later recall going from house to house with a flashlight and an oxygen tank, trying to revive those collapsing in their living rooms. Even the healthy began to feel it: headaches, nausea, burning throats. One resident described it as breathing fire. Another said the air tasted like pennies. In a two-story house near the mill, Mary Benton, a mother of 3, sat at her kitchen table and prayed. Her husband, a mill worker, had come home early, clutching his chest. "It's the fog," he rasped. "It's burning my lungs." She wrapped him in wet towels and cracked the back door, hoping for fresh air, but there was none. Outside, the fog was alive, coiling and pulsing under the street lamps like smoke trapped in a jar. The next morning, news spread that the first deaths had occurred. An elderly woman and a teenage boy had died overnight, their lungs filled with fluid. Then, more followed. Within 48 hours, dozens were sick, and several were dead. The air didn't just hang over Donora, it was killing it. Still, local officials hesitated. The mill owners insisted their emissions were within safe limits. They argued it was a freak weather event, nothing more. No one dared to shut down the furnaces. The economy depended on them, and the company owned nearly everything in town: the mills, the payroll, even the houses many workers lived in. Meanwhile, funeral parlors filled faster than they could prepare bodies. Priests made their rounds in the fog, their voices muffled by the choking air. The town's sirens began to sound, not for shift changes now, but for emergencies, constant, mournful wails echoing through the valley. Children pressed their faces against windows, watching the thick yellow curtain outside. Some whispered that the sun had died. By October 28, Donora had turned into a sealed chamber. Those who tried to flee by car found the bridges closed, the fog was too thick for safe travel. No one could leave. No one could breathe. At the local fire station, volunteers set up makeshift oxygen tents. Men stumbled in, their faces gray-blue. One fireman later said it felt like fighting an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't touch, but it was inside you all the same. In the middle of all this, a strange quiet had settled over the town. The factories still burned, the orange glow of molten metal casting eerie halos in the fog, but everything else was muffled. No birds. No wind. Just coughing, crying, and the low hum of engines that never stopped. By the fourth day, even the mill owners could no longer deny it. Deaths had risen sharply, more than 18 people were dead, and hundreds were hospitalized. The company's physicians blamed existing conditions, heart disease, asthma, anything but the air itself. But deep down, everyone in Donora knew the truth. The air they'd lived by, the smoke they'd been told was the smell of prosperity, had turned on them. The thing that built their town was now destroying it. And as the fog thickened one last time before the winds would finally come, the people of Donora waited, trapped between life and breath, in a place where the very act of inhaling could kill. By October 29th, Donora was gasping. The fog, now a toxic shroud, hung unmoving over the valley. Inside homes, curtains stayed drawn tight. People spoke in whispers, as if the air itself might hear them. Outside, the street lamps glowed in sickly halos, eerie orbs floating in the poison mist. The once bustling mill town had gone silent except for the echoing coughs that drifted from one house to another. At the small hospital on Meldon Avenue, nurses wrapped scarves around their mouths as they ran from bed to bed. The rooms were filled beyond capacity, old men, children, even strong mill hands gasping for breath like fish pulled from water. The doctors had long since run out of oxygen tanks. They were improvising now, filling bathtubs with ice water to cool fevers, holding wet towels over faces to help filter the air. Dr. William Rongos, exhausted and coughing himself, realized he could no longer go door to door. The calls never stopped. His notes from that day, still preserved in archives decades later, were scribbled and uneven, cannot see across the street. Patients dying in minutes. Eyes burning. Lungs, spasms. This is not natural fog. He knew it wasn't. But when he telephoned the mill's head office, they told him to remain calm. The furnaces could not be shut down. Not for fog. Not for rumors. Production had quotas, schedules, contracts to meet. Every hour idle was money lost. And so the furnaces kept burning. And so people kept dying. By the fifth day, panic had turned into a grim kind of resignation. The fog was no longer just an inconvenience, it was death itself, creeping under doors and seeping through the cracks in window frames. It smelled of metal and acid. You could taste it. People stuffed rags under their doors, hung wet sheets in front of windows, and prayed the wind would come. But the wind never came. In one of the mill's worker neighborhoods, a man named Sam Donovan tried to leave town with his wife and children. He piled them into his old Ford, headlights on, driving by instinct alone. Within minutes, he was lost. The road disappeared into the fog. He could barely see the front of his hood. When his wife started coughing violently, he stopped the car, and realized they were still only a few blocks from home. They turned back, defeated. Others tried to flee on foot, wrapping scarves around their mouths, carrying lanterns that glowed like dying stars. Some didn't make it far before collapsing. In a single night, 17 more people died. Funeral homes were overwhelmed. Coffins were arranged in rows. The undertaker, Charles Stacy, said he'd never seen so many bodies arrive so fast, and all from the same invisible cause. Still, there were no official announcements. No orders from the company. No evacuation plans. The town was isolated, cut off by geography and blindness. Newspapers in nearby Pittsburgh hadn't yet grasped what was happening. They called it heavy fog, nothing more. Inside the mills, the workers continued. Some collapsed at their stations, coughing blood onto the floor. Supervisors told them to take a minute and get back to work. The molten metal didn't wait. The bosses didn't either. By October 30th, even those in positions of authority could no longer ignore the mounting death toll. Dr. Rongos, joined by the town's fire chief and mayor, called an emergency meeting. They begged the U.S. Steel Corporation to shut down operations, at least until the fog cleared. The answer came back cold: the situation is exaggerated. There is no proof our emissions are to blame. The next day, Halloween, the fog still hadn't lifted. Children stared out from windows, their costumes lying untouched on chairs. Outside, it was as though the world had ended. The air had grown heavier, pressing down on rooftops. The entire town felt trapped inside a coffin of its own making. When dawn came, the church bells began to toll, not for mass, but for the dead. By the time the first real breeze arrived, on the morning of October 31st, Donora had already suffocated. The wind crept through the valley, stirring the poison fog like smoke from a dying fire. Slowly, painfully, it lifted. The town emerged from the haze, but what was left was unrecognizable. 20 people were dead. Over 6,000, nearly half the town's population, had fallen ill. Cows had collapsed in barns. Birds had vanished entirely. Plants turned brown overnight. The grass itself seemed to have burned. When rescuers from nearby towns finally arrived, they described Donora as a ghost city. Houses were shuttered. The streets were deserted. And the smell, a metallic tang that made your throat close, lingered long after the fog was gone. Reporters swarmed in the following days, scribbling headlines like, "Death Smog in Donora," and "Town suffocates in its own smoke." But for those who lived there, no words could describe the horror of realizing that the air, the one thing every living thing depends on, had turned against them. At the mill gate, soot-streaked workers gathered in silence, staring at the still-burning stacks. The furnaces hissed and roared as if mocking them. It was then that Dr. Rongos, exhausted and hollow-eyed, said something that would echo for years: "If this isn't a warning, then what will be?" But the warning would come at a cost, and the investigation that followed would reveal truths that even the companies couldn't bury. Donora had survived the fog. But America would never look at its own skies the same way again. When the fog finally dispersed, Donora looked like a battlefield. The air was clearer, yes, but the silence that remained was unbearable. Streets that once echoed with the clang of shift whistles and the chatter of workers were now lined with black wreaths. The town's church bells had gone hoarse from tolling. Families emerged cautiously from their homes, faces pale, eyes red from the sting of sulfur. Some found dead pets on their porches. Others found neighbors who hadn't made it through the night. The schools stayed closed. The mill, unbelievably, still operated, its chimneys sending up white ribbons of smoke into a sky that felt somehow thinner, ashamed. Within days, Donora became a national mystery. Reporters descended upon the town, their notebooks filling with grief and disbelief. The headlines grew darker by the hour: "Town that choked to death, mystery fog kills 20 in Steel Valley," and "Is industry poisoning America?" But while the nation gasped, the people of Donora were still coughing. The first outsiders to arrive weren't journalists, they were scientists and federal investigators. Among them was Dr. Clarence Mills, a public health expert from the University of Cincinnati, and Dr. Leonard Greenberg, a government industrial hygienist. They were stunned by what they found. When they entered homes, the smell still lingered, a thick, metallic bite that clung to curtains, clothes, even skin. In the town's morgue, rows of bodies told a grim story: victims of suffocation, lungs inflamed, their airways lined with soot. Samples taken from the deceased revealed high levels of fluorine compounds and sulfur dioxide, both byproducts of the mills. For the first time, the unthinkable was spoken aloud. The fog wasn't natural. It was man-made. Investigators fanned out across Donora. They measured air, soil, and water. They took samples from the mill's slag heaps, its smokestacks, even the walls of nearby houses. They found traces of zinc and cadmium coating everything. It became clear that a temperature inversion had trapped the pollution in the valley, but the real cause was decades of unchecked emissions. The mills had been belching poisons into the sky every day for 40 years. Normally, the wind carried it away before anyone noticed. But when the weather sealed the town under a lid of cold air, all those poisons turned inward, on the very people who produced them. For years, the companies had dismissed complaints. Farmers whose crops withered near the mills were told they'd planted wrong. Residents who developed chronic coughs were told to get used to it. Donora's prosperity had been built on steel and smoke, and questioning that smoke had been a kind of blasphemy. Now the evidence was undeniable. In public meetings, the scientists presented their findings, cautiously at first. They feared retaliation from the powerful U.S. Steel Corporation, which owned both the zinc plant and the wire mill. The company's representatives arrived in crisp suits, denying responsibility, insisting the deaths were caused by natural atmospheric conditions. But the people of Donora were no longer afraid to speak. A widow named Sarah Malone stood up at one of the hearings, holding a faded photograph of her husband. "He worked for your mill for 25 years, she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He breathed your smoke every day. And now he's in the ground. So don't tell me this was weather." The room fell silent. Even the corporate lawyers couldn't meet her eyes. Meanwhile, the federal investigators continued digging. They discovered internal company memos acknowledging harmful emissions as early as the 1920s. Reports about plant workers developing respiratory irritation had been quietly filed away. One memo, later uncovered by journalists, read simply, "Public disclosure of emissions data would be inadvisable." The deeper the investigation went, the clearer the pattern became. Donora wasn't a freak accident. It was the inevitable result of neglect, a perfect storm of weather, pollution, and greed. Dr. Mills and Dr. Greenberg's final report stunned Washington. It concluded that industrial air pollution could directly cause death, something no official study had ever stated so plainly. The findings were sent to the U.S. Public Health Service, where they would eventually become the foundation for national research on air quality. But the process was slow. Too slow for the people still dying from damaged lungs. In the months after the fog, Donora never truly recovered. Residents reported chronic illnesses, asthma, heart disease, persistent coughing that lasted for years. A generation of children grew up knowing the sound of their parents wheezing in the night. Yet, out of that tragedy, something began to shift. Scientists across the country took notice. Universities began studying atmospheric pollution in earnest. For the first time, the words smog control entered the public conversation. Lawmakers, many of whom had never set foot in an industrial town, started to ask questions about what they were breathing in their own cities. Still, it would take years before those questions turned into laws. Industry lobbyists fought back hard, insisting regulation would cripple progress. They framed Donora as an anomaly, a freak meteorological event, not a systemic failure. But Donora had lit a fuse that couldn't be put out. The scientists who walked through its poison streets would go on to shape the 1955 Air Pollution Control Act, the first federal attempt to study and manage air quality. Later, their findings would influence the creation of the Clean Air Act of 1963, and eventually the Environmental Protection Agency itself. The town that couldn't breathe had become a warning, a scar etched into America's conscience. And while Washington debated and industries deflected, the people of Donora carried the memory like a wound that never healed. They buried their dead, cleaned their windows, reopened their shops, and tried to live again beneath a sky they no longer trusted. But something had changed, not just in the air, but in the nation's lungs. Donora had forced America to look up, and finally see what it had been breathing all along. The fog had lifted from Donora, but its shadow stretched far beyond Pennsylvania. Across the country, whispers of the town that choked reached classrooms, government offices, and factory floors. It was no longer just a tragedy, it was a warning carved into the lungs of a nation that had mistaken smoke for success. In Washington, the U.S. Public Health Service began compiling the data from Donora. Scientists reviewed the autopsy reports, the atmospheric studies, the chemical samples pulled from soot-stained walls. Their findings were chillingly precise. The fog had trapped 12 tons of airborne poisons over the town, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, zinc oxide, and hydrogen fluoride among them. It wasn't the weather that killed Donora. It was the system. Yet for years, nothing happened. The mills stayed open. The corporations denied guilt. Their lawyers argued that since only a small number of people had died, directly, from the event, it couldn't justify federal interference. They framed the deaths as an unfortunate act of nature. But in small, quiet offices across the country, scientists were not forgetting. The Donora data became the bedrock of a movement, one that would take more than a decade to bear fruit. Meanwhile, in Donora, life limped on. The survivors returned to their routines, but everything was different. Children grew up calling it the death fog. Every time the weather turned damp, people shut their windows in fear. Asthma cases rose. Residents moved away, unable to shake the smell of burnt metal that still haunted their dreams. The once booming steel town began to hollow out, like a lung losing air. In 1950, a young scientist named Dr. Lester Lave visited Donora to study its long-term health effects. He interviewed residents who had survived the smog and discovered something terrifying. Many of them were still dying slowly, years later, of chronic bronchitis and heart disease. The invisible killer had never truly left. His findings added new urgency to the debate. This wasn't a freak event, it was the cost of industrialization without restraint. By 1952, another smog disaster struck, this time in London, killing over 12,000 people. That catastrophe jolted the world awake. Suddenly, Donora was no longer a lone tragedy, it was part of a pattern, a global reckoning with the price of unchecked pollution. The U.S. could no longer ignore it. In 1955, Congress passed the Air Pollution Control Act, the first federal law to recognize air contamination as a public health problem. Though limited in power, it was a symbolic step, a breath drawn after years of suffocation. The act funded research, monitoring, and local control programs. It didn't regulate industry yet, but it acknowledged something that industry had long denied: air pollution kills. And Donora was the proof. In the following years, as industrial smog thickened over cities like Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, and Gary, Indiana, the name Donora resurfaced again and again in hearings and policy papers. Each new push for clean air cited that small town in Pennsylvania where 20 people died and 6,000 were injured. Each new environmental law traced its roots to the suffocating valley where the air had once turned to poison. By 1963, the Clean Air Act gave the federal government authority to research and set guidelines for air quality. In 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was formed, enforcing standards that had once been unthinkable in Donora's day. Those regulations would go on to reduce industrial emissions, limit sulfur content in fuels, and require scrubbers on smokestacks, the very measures that could have saved Donora 2 decades earlier. But history never forgets its price. In 1948, 20 people died in a week. In the decades after, hundreds more succumbed to illnesses that could be traced back to those poison days. The fog may have lifted, but its ghosts remained in the lungs of a generation. Years later, when the Donora zinc works finally shut down, the town stood still. For the first time in nearly a century, the sky over Donora was clear. The people who had stayed behind, older now, their children grown, watched the smokestacks go cold. Some wept. Others simply stood in silence, remembering what the price of progress had cost them. In 2008, the Donora Smog Museum opened on McKean Avenue, built inside an old storefront. Its slogan reads, "Clean air started here." Inside, yellowed photographs show families wearing gas masks, doctors carrying oxygen tanks door to door, and the heavy fog that looked like twilight even at noon. Visitors walk through the exhibits in hushed awe, breathing freely, but always aware that the air they take for granted was once bought with blood. Every year, on the anniversary of the smog, the museum staff hold a small memorial. They read the names of the 20 who died and the many who suffered. And when the reading ends, there's always a pause, a collective silence that feels like a held breath. Because the lesson of Donora isn't just history, it's a mirror. Every law that protects the air, every regulation that limits emissions, every standard that measures particulate matter, each of them is a line written in the memory of that town. Laws written in breath and blood. And as modern cities once again face rising pollution and climate alarms, the story of Donora whispers a single, chilling truth through time: what we breathe binds us all. And when we forget that, the air remembers. The fog of 1948 may have vanished, but the warning it carried still lingers. Every time a factory flares, every time a city coughs beneath its own sky. For Donora, it was too late. For the rest of us, there's still time. If stories like this need to be remembered, subscribe to Laws Written in Blood so you never miss one.